September 12, 1943. Thorpe Abbotts Airfield, England. The airfield slept under a thin layer of fog and the smell of burned oil. The only light came from a single flood lamp over Hangar 3, where Staff Sergeant Joseph "Joe" Sarnowski stood with his arms crossed, watching a crippled B-17 fight to stay in the air. Its name, Memphis Belle Returns, was painted in chipped yellow on the nose, but nothing about it looked lucky now. The bomber's landing gear wouldn't drop. The hydraulic system was dead. Sparks flickered from the belly as the pilot tried to force the gear down with the emergency pump. It didn't move. "Gear's gone," the tower said over the loudspeaker. Joe muttered, "That's the third one this week." The bomber came in low. The engine screamed as the pilot leveled the wings for a belly landing. When the fuselage hit the concrete, sparks turned to fire. The aircraft slid 300 yards before the right wing caught the ground and tore free. The explosion rolled through the field like thunder. The fireball lit up the clouds. 4 men died instantly. 6 were pulled from the wreckage alive, but mangled. Burns, broken bones, shock. The smell of scorched hydraulic fluid mixed with smoke and rain. Joe didn't move. He just stared at what was left, jaw tight, eyes hollow. It wasn't the Germans that had killed them this time. It was a 40-cent aluminum tube. Later that night, when the flames died down, Joe crawled under the wreck himself. The metal was still hot. He found the line, the same one he'd seen a dozen times before, split open along the fuselage. One clean puncture, no bigger than a pencil hole. All the fluid drained in seconds. No hydraulics meant no brakes, no flaps, no landing gear. The crew could make it through flak, fighters, and 1,000 miles of hell, but if one bullet hit that line, they were done before they touched the ground. The next morning's report listed the loss as battle damage. Joe crossed the words out and wrote bad design. He'd been a car mechanic before the war. Cleveland, Ohio. Grease up to his elbows, fixing trucks and tractors that no one else could save. He didn't care about ranks or paperwork. He cared about whether a machine worked. When he joined the Army Air Forces in 1942, they made him a B-17 crew chief because he could rebuild an engine faster than anyone on base. But the deeper he learned the plane, the more one thing gnawed at him. The hydraulic lines ran completely exposed along the underside of the fuselage. A single round could cut through them like string. He'd brought it up again and again. He'd sent written reports, sketches, even a request for permission to add an armor sleeve over the lines. The answer came back from headquarters 2 weeks later. Denied. Field modifications violated Army Air Force Regulation 65-14. All design changes had to be tested and approved by Wright Field Engineering Command in Ohio. Estimated review time, 12 to 18 months. 18 months. At the current rate, there wouldn't be a single crew left by then. By September 1943, the 8th Air Force had flown more than 300 high-altitude missions. 40% of its bombers were lost to enemy action. But buried inside the maintenance logs was a quieter number. 23% of those losses happened after the battle. Planes that made it home but couldn't land. Burned alive on British runways because of a broken hydraulic line. Command called it acceptable attrition. Joe called it murder by clipboard. That night he stayed behind when the others went to chow. The hangar was dark except for the hum of the generator and the rain dripping through the roof. He rolled up his sleeves and grabbed a piece of scrap aluminum from a wrecked wing panel. He hammered it flat on his bench, cut it into a narrow strip, and bent it around a section of damaged hydraulic line. The idea was simple, a sleeve strong enough to stop shrapnel from slicing through. He lined the inside with thin rubber scavenged from an old radio mount. Drilled holes, fitted clamps, tested pressure. Cost of materials, 43 cents. He tested it on his own plane first, the group's lead ship. When he cycled the landing gear, it moved smooth, no drag, no leaks. He ran his fingers along the sleeve, metal still warm from the drill. "That's it," he whispered. You're not killing anyone else." Corporal Davis, the fuel chief, walked in halfway through. "What the hell's that?" "Just armor for the lines." "You got clearance for that?" Joe wiped his hands. "Do I look like I'm waiting for clearance?" Davis shook his head. "You'll get court-martialed." "Not if it works." Over the next 5 nights, Joe repeated the process, 1 bomber each night, always after lights out, when the officers were asleep. He worked by flashlight, sweat dripping from his chin onto the metal. Every hammer strike echoed through the hangar like a heartbeat. He didn't take notes. He didn't file a report. He just kept working. By dawn, 6 aircraft carried the modification. No one noticed. It looked factory-made, just another piece of aluminum blending into the fuselage. The next day, one of those planes, Devil's Daughter, took off for Schweinfurt. Joe watched her climb until she vanished into the overcast sky. He stayed near the radio all afternoon, waiting. When she returned, she came in shot to pieces, 47 holes in the fuselage, 1 engine gone, but she landed perfectly. The hydraulic lines had taken 3 hits. The sleeve held. No leaks. 10 men walked away. 3 other B-17s that day tried to land with hydraulic failures. All 3 burned. 21 men dead. That night, the pilots from Devil's Daughter came to the hangar carrying a dented piece of tubing with the sleeve still attached. The aluminum was gouged, scorched, but intact. "Whatever the hell you did," the pilot said, "do it to every damn plane on base." Word spread fast. Crews from other squadrons started asking for Sarnowski's fix. Mechanics copied it using scrap metal and empty beer cans. Within 3 weeks, 40 bombers had the unauthorized modification. Losses among those aircraft dropped nearly 20%. But the regulations didn't care about results. In early November, a visiting Air Force inspector found the modification during a routine check. He ordered the planes grounded and demanded to know who installed it. By noon, everyone pointed to Joe. The next day, his commanding officer called him in. "You modified government property without authorization." Joe nodded. "Yes, sir." "You violated federal regulation." "I saved lives." "That's not the point." "It's exactly the point." He was ordered to remove every sleeve immediately. Joe refused. "You want me to take them off? You might as well paint targets on the hydraulic lines." The officer stared at him for a long moment. "Then you leave me no choice." By nightfall, Sarnowski was under arrest, confined to barracks, facing a court-martial for insubordination and unauthorized modification of military equipment. Outside, the engines of the bombers roared as ground crews prepared for the next day's mission. Planes that no longer had the protection he'd given them. Joe sat on his cot, hands black with grease, staring at the wall. In his head, he could still see the fireball from Memphis Bell Returns lighting up the English sky. He'd tried to stop it from happening again. Now the Air Force wanted to make an example out of him. What he didn't know, what nobody on that base knew yet, was that in the coming weeks, his 43-cent idea would change everything. October 1943, Thorpe Abbotts Airfield, England. The hangars never really slept. Even at 2 a.m, you could hear the cough of generators, the squeal of metal carts, and the low murmur of mechanics trying to keep dying aircraft alive long enough for one more mission. Joe Sarnowski was back on the floor, out of the barracks, working in silence. The official order still said he was under investigation, but his commanding officer, practical, exhausted, looked the other way. They needed planes, not paperwork. Joe's modification had already spread too far to contain. Every mechanic in the 91st Bomb Group had seen what happened to Devil's Daughter during the Schweinfurt raid. 47 hits, 3 in the hydraulic system, and she still landed like a training flight. Her crew had come back holding the dented sleeve like a holy relic. That image spread faster than any regulation memo. By October 10th, nearly half the group's bombers carried Sarnowski's armor. No official documentation, No inspection reports, just a whispered line in the hangar. Put the sleeves on, Joe's way. Sarnosky didn't brag. He worked quietly, fixing planes, keeping to himself. But word reached him from pilots he'd never met. One came into the hangar, still in his flight suit, holding a section of hydraulic line with a jagged hole burned through the outer sleeve. The inner tubing was untouched. "This thing saved my crew," the man said. "I owe you beers for life." The modification had been tested the only way that mattered, under fire. Crews came back from Bremen, Kiel, Hamburg, covered in holes, and still alive. Their landing log showed something no one expected. Hydraulic failure rates had dropped across the entire airfield. But success breeds attention. On October 13th, a team from the 8th Air Force Engineering Division arrived unannounced. 2 captains and a civilian consultant from Wright Field, their uniforms spotless, shoes polished, faces blank. They inspected 6 aircraft and found identical modifications on each. They took photos, measurements, and notes without a word. The next day, a formal order arrived. Cease all unauthorized modifications immediately. Remove existing unapproved parts. Report all responsible personnel. The squadron went silent. In the hangar, one of the pilots tossed the order onto Joe's workbench. "They want these taken off. You believe that?" Joe stared at the paper. "They'll kill more crews doing that than the Germans ever could." "Then what do? "We don't take them off." That night, instead of stopping, Sarnosky doubled down. He gathered the youngest mechanics, the ones who still had something to prove, and taught them how to fit the sleeves properly. He showed them where to clamp, how to line the rubber backing, how to run the pressure test without leaving a trace. He told them nothing about authorization, only about survival. "Every plane that leaves this base," he said, "goes out with a heartbeat. You guard that heartbeat. Don't let a pencil pusher take it away." By mid-October, more than 60 bombers at Thorpe Abbotts carried the fix. The base's hydraulic failure rate dropped from 1 in 6 to 1 in 25. That meant hundreds of men making it home who otherwise wouldn't. Then came the mission that changed everything. October 14, 1943, Schweinfurt-Regensburg, the largest daylight bombing raid of the war. 291 B-17s left England that morning. 60 never came back. It was the bloodiest day in American aviation history. Among the few that did return was a battered B-17 called Lucky Lady. She took a direct hit from a 20mm shell over Germany. Shrapnel tore through her bomb bay, hit the hydraulic manifold, and ricocheted off the sleeve Joe had installed the night before. The crew didn't know it yet, but that cheap strip of aluminum had just saved all 10 of them. When Lucky Lady landed, the line was dented but intact. The system held pressure. The pilot stumbled out, still shaking, and shouted across the tarmac, "Whoever built that thing, thank him for my life." Word spread through the base like fire through dry grass. Crews refused to fly without the fix. Mechanics worked through the night installing more. When headquarters demanded compliance reports, most of them lied. All modifications removed. They weren't removed, they were doubling, but bureaucracy always catches up. A week later, a major from Group Command arrived. He called Sarnosky into his office. "You've been warned," the major said. "You're still making them." "Yes, sir." "You understand the penalty?" "I understand what happens when they don't have it." The major slammed his pen down. "You don't get to decide policy, Sergeant." "No, sir," Joe said calmly. "I just keep them alive long enough for policy to matter." There was silence. The major stared at him for a long time, then looked away. "You're done, Sarnosky. Hand in your tools." 2 hours later, military police escorted him off the flight line. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He just looked at the planes lined up in the fog, their wings stretching into the distance, and muttered, "Don't let them take it off." That evening, the pilots held an informal meeting in the mess hall. 35 crews, nearly 400 men. When the commander ordered all missions to resume with unmodified aircraft, every pilot signed a petition. "We will not fly without Sarnowski's fix." The next morning, the 91st Bomb Group was grounded. 35 bombers sat silent on the runway. The Germans didn't do it. The Air Force did. Back in the holding barracks, Joe sat on his cot, staring at the same wrench he'd used to install the first sleeve a month earlier. He could hear engines warming up outside from other squadrons still flying. His group wouldn't launch today, maybe not tomorrow. He knew what that meant. The longer they stayed grounded, the worse it would get for him. But deep down, he didn't regret it. Not for a second. He'd seen what happened when machines failed and men burned for someone else's delay. He'd made a choice: break the rules or bury more friends. In Washington, engineers debated theory. In England, blood decided who was right. What Joe didn't know was that the shockwave from his defiance had already reached the highest levels of command. A general named Curtis LeMay had just been handed a report describing unapproved hydraulic modifications resulting in statistically significant reduction of post-battle failures. LeMay's comment was short and brutal. "Test it. If it works, I don't care who built it." November 2nd, 1943. Thorpe Abbott's airfield looked calm from the outside: frosted fields, mist over the runway, distant hum of engines from neighboring bases. But inside the 91st Bomb Group, the air was poison. No planes were flying, no one was talking. And at the center of it all sat one man, Staff Sergeant Joe Sarnowski, the mechanic who had saved hundreds of lives and now faced ruin for it. He'd been confined to quarters for a week, stripped of his tools, ordered to stay silent while the Air Force decided what to do with him. The paperwork was already in motion. Court-martial for unauthorized modification of military equipment. Maximum penalty: 5 years military prison, dishonorable discharge. In another war, they would have given him a medal. The investigation team from Wright Field arrived on November 6th, 3 officers, 1 civilian engineer, and a typewriter that clacked like a firing squad. They wanted every detail: who designed it, who installed it, how many planes were altered, and why command hadn't been informed. Joe told them the truth. "Because your engineers were still drawing blueprints while our crews were dying." That didn't go over well. The lead investigator, a major with the kind of face that had never smelled hydraulic fluid or burned skin, leaned forward. "Regulations exist for a reason, Sergeant. Unauthorized changes put lives at risk." Joe stared him down. "So does bureaucracy." The room went silent. The major wrote something in his notes and said, without looking up, "That'll be all." 2 days later, the order came through. Every modified B-17 in the 91st must have the sleeves removed immediately. Crews were to fly only with original factory equipment. Anyone caught refusing would face disciplinary action. That same evening, 35 pilots and co-pilots gathered in the mess hall. No cameras, no speeches, just anger, exhaustion, and a feeling that the brass had lost their minds. Captain Robert "Red" Wexler, commander of Devil's Daughter, slammed the memo down on the table. "They want us to take off the only thing keeping us alive. You gonna do it?" Nobody answered. Then a voice from the back, Lieutenant Harris, Lucky Lady's navigator, said, "I'll fly the day they strip their desks of paperwork before they strip our planes of armor." The room erupted. By dawn, every pilot in the 91st had signed a single page scrawled with grease and coffee stains. "We will not fly without Sarnowski's modification." It was the closest thing to a mutiny the 8th Air Force had seen. When command found out, operations for the entire group were suspended. 35 bombers grounded, hundreds of men waiting. From the control tower, the flight line looked like a graveyard, gray hulks sitting motionless in the fog. The higher-ups panicked. The Germans weren't grounding American bombers. Americans were. General Curtis LeMay himself was flown in from High Wycombe. He was known for two things: ice-cold logic and zero patience for excuses. When he arrived at Thorpe Abbott's, the first thing he asked was, "Is the mechanic still in custody?" "Yes, sir," came the reply. "Good. Keep him there until I've seen this damn thing myself." LeMay walked the flight line, his cigar glowing in the mist, inspecting the modified aircraft one by one. He said nothing for half an hour. Finally, he stopped at Lucky Lady, the bomber that had taken 3 direct hits to the hydraulic system and landed anyway. He tapped the metal sleeve with his cigar. "This it?" The maintenance officer nodded. "Yes, sir. Field modification. Unauthorized." LeMay grunted. "Unauthorized, huh?" He motioned to the engineering team. "Cut one off and take it back to the hangar. I want a full test tonight." That night, under the glow of portable floodlights, Air Force engineers ran hydraulic pressure tests, simulated shrapnel impacts, and compared results against unmodified lines. The conclusion was undeniable. The sleeve worked. It absorbed small arms hits, stopped leaks, and added no measurable weight. The final report landed on LeMay's desk at midnight. Effectiveness, 100% under field test. Estimated cost, 43 cents per aircraft. Official redesign estimate, $2,400 per aircraft, 14 months minimum. Projected reduction in hydraulic failure, 60%. Projected aircrew lives saved, 2,400. LeMay read it twice, exhaled a cloud of smoke, and said the words that would end the standoff. "Implement it, quietly, and for God's sake, don't tell Washington who built it." By morning, the entire 91st was back in the air. The court-martial was quietly dropped. There was no ceremony, no apology, no memo. Joe was released from custody, handed back his tools, and told to resume standard maintenance duties. When he walked back into the hangar, every mechanic and pilot stopped what they were doing. No one clapped, no one saluted. They just stood there, silent, until Joe picked up a wrench and went back to work. Only then did the hangar roar back to life. But inside, Joe was hollow. He'd saved his men, but lost his faith. 2 weeks later, a confidential Air Force bulletin went out to all bomber groups in Europe. Effective immediately, modify all B-17 and B-24 hydraulic lines according to Engineering Directive 1243A. Source, Air Force Engineering Division. No mention of Joe Sarnosky. No acknowledgement that the directive came from a mechanic who'd risked prison to make it happen. That winter, as the new sleeves rolled out across every airfield in England, hydraulic-related crashes dropped by more than half. Command called it a technical advancement in maintenance procedure. The men who flew called it something else. They called it Sarnosky's fix. When asked later if he wanted credit, Joe just shook his head. "They already gave me what I wanted," he said. "They stopped dying." He'd won the fight, but the victory came with a silence that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Spring 1944. The English countryside was greening again, but on most mornings the sky over Thorpe Abbott's was black with exhaust. Dozens of B-17s lifted off in formation, engines shaking the earth. They carried a quiet, invisible modification beneath their skin, a strip of aluminum and rubber that cost less than half a dollar. Every one of them owed its existence to a man whose name had already been erased from the paperwork. Hydraulic-related crashes dropped 60% within 3 months. Crews who once braced for fiery landings now rolled home on solid tires. Mechanics noticed the hangars felt different: fewer funerals, fewer body bags, fewer nights spent cleaning blood from instrument panels. The Sarnosky sleeve, as the pilot still called it, was working across the 8th Air Force. By summer, the same directive was quietly extended to B-24s and even to the brand-new B-29s rolling off assembly lines in Wichita. Nobody mentioned where the idea came from. In the official manuals, it was listed simply as Protective Reinforcement, Revision A-12. On the line, men still whispered his name, but in Washington, he no longer existed. When the war ended in August 1945, the brass celebrated the engineers, the strategists, the generals. Joe Sarnosky boarded a transport back to the States with nothing but a duffel bag, a toolbox, and the faint smell of oil that never left his hands. No commendations, no record, just a quiet discharge form stamped honorable. Back in Cleveland, he returned to what he knew, fixing cars in a rented garage behind a diner. Customers liked him because he never talked much and never overcharged. When someone asked if he'd been in the war, he just said, "Yeah, maintenance." For years, he lived the way he worked, precisely, quietly, invisible. By the 1960s, aviation had changed. Jetliners replaced bombers. Mechanics worked in clean hangars with chrome tools. One afternoon, a Boeing engineer studying an old B-17 hydraulic schematic noticed a note in the margin. Field modification, 1943. Results excellent. The design matched the reinforcement used on the company's new 707 civilian aircraft. He traced the origin through Air Force archives. There was no inventor listed, just a reference to a maintenance initiative, 8th Air Force, England. The engineer wrote in his report, "Origin unknown, likely the work of a ground crew chief." Joe never knew his idea had crossed into peacetime aviation. In 1982, nearly 40 years after Schweinfurt, the Air Force Historical Foundation declassified portions of the hydraulic system investigation. The data stunned everyone. The modification now attributed to an unidentified sergeant had prevented an estimated 2,400 bomber losses, nearly 19,000 airmen who made it home because of it. A year later, they found him. A letter arrived at his small apartment above the garage. Mr. Joseph Sarnosky, the Air Force Historical Foundation wishes to formally recognize your contribution to the safety of U.S. Army Air Force's personnel during World War II. He read it once, folded it back into the envelope, and threw it in the trash. When a representative called to confirm his attendance, Joe just said, "You tried to court-martial me for that fix. I'm not coming." The man on the phone paused. "Sergeant, it saved thousands of lives." Joe's voice was steady. "Yeah, that's why I built it. Not for medals." He hung up. That was the last time anyone from the Air Force spoke to him. In the years that followed, Joe kept working. His hands grew slower, his eyes weaker, but he could still tell when an engine was off by half a heartbeat. He never mentioned the war again. He died in 2001 at the age of 79. No military honors, no mention in the papers. Just a small obituary in a Cleveland daily. Joseph A. Sarnosky, mechanic. 14 years later, a historian digitizing declassified maintenance logs found the full court-martial file. It included the original photos of his modification, the pilot testimonies, and the signed order to drop all charges. The evidence was undeniable. One man's illegal act had saved more airmen than any single weapon of the war. In 2019, the Air Force finally added his name to the Unsung Heroes of the 8th Air Force database. The ceremony lasted 15 minutes. No cameras, no speeches. Just a small plaque mounted on the wall of the Air Force Museum at Dayton. Next to it, under glass, sits a piece of twisted aluminum recovered from a crashed B-17, a single hydraulic sleeve, scorched but intact. The inscription reads, "Staff Sergeant Joseph Sarnosky, for every life saved by a rule broken." The museum guide says most visitors walk past without noticing, but for those who stop to read, there's a moment of silence, then a slow nod, the kind people make when they recognize something true. Because sometimes history doesn't belong to those who followed the rules. It belongs to the man who broke them to save everyone else.